Samantha pressed her back against the wooden shelves, the sharp edges digging into her spine. She did not breathe. Every muscle in her body locked, holding her rigid against the wall. A few feet away, the man sat motionless, his posture stiff, his presence filling the cramped study. He did not look away. His eyes were pale, fixed on her with a predatory stillness that made the air feel thin and difficult to inhale. A low, rhythmic sound began to emanate from the corner, the faint, wet scrape of something moving against stone. The room had shifted. The familiar scent of old paper and wood had been replaced by the heavy, cloying smell of damp earth and rot. It was a suffocating weight that pressed against her chest. Samantha gripped her phone until her knuckles turned white, the flashlight beam cutting a frantic, trembling arc across the desk. The man remained seated, his gaze tracking the light with mechanical precision, never blinking. He was waiting for her to move, to break, or to run. The silence in the room stretched thin, vibrating with an unseen tension. Samantha shifted her weight, but the floorboards did not creak. They felt solid, like granite. She was pinned by his stare, trapped in the center of the dark room, with nowhere left to turn. The man began to rise. His movements were not fluid. They were segmented and harsh. His joints emitted a series of dry, rhythmic clicks, like brittle twigs snapping under heavy pressure. He did not use his arms to leverage his weight. He simply unfolded, his frame lengthening with a series of jerking, unnatural twitches. Samantha did not wait to see what he would do next. She shoved off the shelves, her breath catching in her throat, and scrambled toward the arched curtain she had passed through only moments before. Her boots slid on the floorboards as she pivoted, her hand reaching out to sweep aside the heavy fabric. Her fingers slammed into cold, unyielding stone. She recoiled, the impact vibrating up her arm. She clawed at the surface, searching for a seam, a gap, anything. There was only solid, rough-hewn masonry. The curtain was gone. The wall felt immovable, as if it had been part of the foundation for centuries. She spun around, her flashlight beam swinging wildly across the room. The space behind her had changed. Every potential exit was sealed, replaced by the same cold gray stone. She was no longer in a study. She was in a vault. The man took one slow, deliberate step toward her, his head tilted at an impossible angle, his pale eyes reflecting the shaking light. Samantha scanned the surface of the desk, her flashlight beam flickering against the dark wood. Amidst the scattered papers lay a heavy ledger bound in cracked hide. She pulled it closer, the weight of the book straining her wrist. The pages were yellowed, stiff with age. She flipped through the first few sheets. Every line was filled with names, written in elegant, precise script. Each one was violently crossed out by a thick, jagged stroke of red ink. She turned the pages faster, her breath hitching as the names blurred into a long, grim history of individuals who had occupied this space before her. She reached the final active page. The list ended abruptly. There, in the center of the parchment, her own name stood in sharp black ink. It was pristine. It was untouched. No red line marred the surface. She traced her fingers over the letters, feeling the cold texture of the paper. The house had not been keeping secrets. It had been documenting its history, waiting for this exact moment to conclude the sequence. She looked up, the flashlight trembling in her grip. The room felt smaller now, the stone walls pulsing with a low, rhythmic vibration. She was not a witness to a mystery. She was the final entry in a ledger that had been gathering names for decades. The man moved forward, closing the space between them until his face was inches from hers. He brought with him the scent of stagnant water and cold, damp earth. Samantha pressed her back against the shelves, her lungs tight, unable to draw a full breath. He did not look at her eyes. He looked past her, his gaze fixed on the ledger. He reached out a hand, his fingers long and skeletal, and hovered them over the porcelain cup on the desk. The steam curled around his knuckles, yet he did not touch it. He pulled his hand back, the movement stiff and deliberate, and pointed a bony, trembling finger directly at the open page. His nail tapped the parchment. He moved his finger down, sliding it across the surface of the paper until it stopped at the blank space immediately below her name. He held the position, his finger pressed firmly into the fiber of the page. He did not speak, but the weight of his attention forced her eyes downward. She looked at the empty line. It was waiting. The man leaned closer, his breath cold against her skin, and tapped the blank space once more. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. He was waiting for her to fill the void. The pressure of his finger on the ledger was absolute. Samantha's hand shook, her knuckles turning white as she clutched her phone. The beam of light danced violently against the man's face, catching the hollows of his eyes. Then, her grip failed. The phone slipped, tumbling through the air before slamming into the stone floor. The impact was sharp, a brittle sound that cut through the silence. The screen did not go dark. Instead, it spiderwebbed, creating a web of fractured glass that sent jagged, erratic light skittering across the room. The familiar space distorted. Shapes that were solid a moment ago began to stretch and warp. The man moved, and his shadow detached itself from his feet, crawling up the stone walls like thick, black ink spreading through water. It grew, elongating until it loomed over the ceiling, swallowing the corners of the room in darkness. Samantha scrambled back, but the floor felt uneven, shifting beneath her boots. The man stood tall, his silhouette now a towering void against the dim, flickering glow of the cracked screen. The light pulsed, casting long, rhythmic shadows that made the room feel as if it were breathing. She was no longer just standing in a room. She was being folded into the dark. Samantha scrambled backward, her breath hitching in her chest, but her heel struck something hard and unyielding. A heavy, iron-bound trunk blocked her path. She was pinned. The man stepped into the remaining light, his movements fluid and predatory. A grin spread across his face, the skin pulling back to reveal teeth that resembled jagged shards of glass. He did not speak. The sound of his breathing was a low, rhythmic rasp that filled the small space. He reached into his pocket with a slow, deliberate motion. He pulled out a fountain pen. The nib was stained dark, a thick, viscous substance clinging to the metal. He held the object out toward her, his hands steady and pale in the flickering light. He gestured first to the pen, then back to the blank line in the open ledger. Samantha stared at the metal. Her own reflection stared back from the man's dead. Colorless eyes, a girl trapped in a tomb, holding a dying light. She realized then that the house had not been keeping secrets. It had been waiting for this exact moment. She looked at the pen. She looked at the man. Her hand began to tremble, but she had nowhere left to run. Samantha reached out. Her fingers moved with a life of their own, trembling violently as they bridged the gap between her and the man. She made contact. The metal of the pen felt impossibly cold, like a blade pulled from ice, biting into her skin. The sensation traveled up her arm, a sharp jolt that numbed her nerves. The moment her skin touched the surface, the room fell into absolute silence. The rhythmic rasp of the man's breath vanished. The flickering light from her shattered phone died instantly, leaving her in total suffocating darkness. Samantha blinked, but the void remained unbroken. She reached out to push the man away, but her hand met only empty air. He was gone. The heavy, damp smell of rot lingered for a heartbeat, then faded into the scent of old, dry paper. She stood alone in the center of the room. The silence was not empty. It was heavy, pressing against her eardrums like deep water. She could feel the ledger on the desk, its presence looming in the dark. She shifted her weight, and the floorboards did not creak. The house held its breath. She held the pen, its weight dragging her hand downward. Anchored by a force that did not belong to her, the pen felt like a lead weight in her grip. It began to pull her arm downward, not with a jerk, but with a steady, relentless drag toward the desk. Samantha tried to pull back, but her muscles refused to obey. Her hand moved with a mechanical precision that felt alien to her own body. She reached the ledger. The paper was dry, brittle, and yellowed. As the nib hovered over the blank line, she did not need to dip it. A dark, viscous liquid began to seep upward from the fibers of the page itself. It swirled like trapped smoke, rising in thin, jagged tendrils to meet the metal tip of the pen. The liquid was cold, smelling of deep, undisturbed earth. It clung to the nib, refusing to drip, defying gravity as it bridged the distance between the parchment and her hand. Her fingers burned where they touched the fountain pen. She could feel the pulse of the house moving through the ink, a slow, rhythmic thrumming that synchronized with her own heartbeat. She was no longer just holding the instrument. She was being fused to the page. The pen forced her knuckles to tighten. She felt the nib bite into the grain of the paper, ready to record a name that had been waiting for its turn for centuries. She pressed the nib against the parchment. The ink flowed with a sudden, violent surge, soaking into the fibers as if the book were thirsty. Samantha tried to pull her hand away, but the pen was anchored to the paper by a magnetic pull. She wrote the first letter of her name. Her skin prickled as the ink turned freezing cold, spreading up her wrist like liquid ice. She moved to the second letter, and the house responded. A low, guttural groan erupted from the foundation, vibrating through the floorboards and into the marrow of her bones. The stone walls began to hum, a deep, resonant sound that made the room tremble. Dust shook loose from the ceiling, dancing in the air. She reached the final letter, her vision blurred, the room swaying with the force of the house's awakening. She finished the stroke, the ink binding her signature to the ancient parchment with a sharp, stinging bite. The moment the pen lifted, the last remaining sliver of light in the room vanished. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, then cut out entirely. Total, absolute stillness descended. The house had stopped groaning. It was waiting. Samantha stood in the absolute dark, the weight of the house now pressing down upon her shoulders, heavy and permanent. The metal fountain pen slipped from her numb fingers. It hit the stone floor with a sharp, metallic ring that echoed into the corners of the vast, hollow space. The sound was distinct, final and heavy, like a gavel closing a case that could never be reopened. Samantha did not move. She stood in the center of the dark, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rhythmic breaths. There was no longer a need to search for an exit. The walls no longer felt like stone. They felt like skin. She reached out, her fingertips tracing the air, and felt the house vibrating in sync with her own pulse. The dampness that had permeated the room was gone, replaced by a cold, stagnant stillness that offered no comfort. She was no longer a visitor. She was the anchor. The ledger remained open on the desk, its pages still under the weight of her signature. She felt the house shifting around her, its structural bones settling into a new configuration, one that centered entirely on her presence. She closed her eyes, and for the first time, she did not see darkness. She saw the blueprints of the house, the hidden corridors, and the history stored within the mortar. The transition was complete. She was the new guardian of the Middleton house, and there was nowhere left to go.